very happy to be here this morning. To tell you the truth, I can't remember how long I'm supposed to talk. So let's make this an exchange this morning. I don't want you to feel like you're in a class at the university this morning, but you'll probably feel that way for just a little while. But what I'd like to do is throw out some ideas for you, and then we can discuss how those ideas might be helpful to you in your work in helping families and children and so on. One thing that was not mentioned was that I got my undergraduate degree here at Arizona State University. And while I was at Arizona State University, I got a minor degree in social welfare. And as part of that minor degree, I did an internship with the Arizona Baptist Children's Services, where I was helping work with foster kids. And I also, I don't know if I have the right name for this organization anymore, it was the Maricopa Welfare Rights Organization. And I don't know if that still exists or if that's the right title or not. But in that work, I was working especially with families in very low income circumstances. But what we find often, and what you know full well, is that many times some of our most troubled families are families that are suffering major economic disadvantage. And a good question is, how does that occur? And of course it occurs in many different ways, but how does it occur, and how can you help to overcome some of the difficulties that are created by economic problems? Economic problems are sometimes long-term, they're sometimes chronic, and some of those come about because of disadvantaged segments of the population. Sometimes economic problems are sudden and unexpected, as happened during this last recession, where many middle-class families and many presumably secure people in their work, people in their 40s and their 50s and so on, who thought that their jobs were secure and their work was settled, in fact lost their jobs and have suffered dramatic economic downturns. So the way people get to situations of economic problems can vary a great deal. I'm going to do some numbers this morning, and I'll explain a little bit what the numbers mean. And some of you will say, that's interesting. Some of you will say, why on earth did he do that? But I'll try to make them worthwhile for you to consider. So socioeconomic status is increasingly becoming, in the world of academics, is increasingly becoming of interest for several different reasons. The current economic climate and the salience of socioeconomic status for policymakers and the problems that we face today are one reason that academics as well as others are especially interested in how economic issues influence families and children. There's also been a transition in the consideration of socioeconomic status in developmental theory. It used to be you would do a study in child development, and you'd include income or education as control variables, get them out of the way, so they didn't make sure they don't explain why, when parents behave in a certain kind of way, it influences their kids, and trying to be sure that above and beyond their economic or their educational situation, those parenting behaviors have an influence. Well, what we're finding more and more is that the way parents parent and the way children grow and develop and so on is influenced mightily by educational background and economic circumstances. So socioeconomic status is becoming more and more what would be considered a causal agent in consideration of developmental theory. Now, the common measures of socioeconomic status typically include education and income. There are two major theoretical approaches to why it is that a family's or a child's socioeconomic status would be related to the way children grow and develop, and be related to the way parents get along with each other, as we'll talk about in just a few minutes. One is the social causation perspective. That is, some people believe that, my background is actually in sociology, and sociologists have always believed that income and education have an effect on how parents raise children and how children grow and develop. But there's an alternative perspective, and that's called the social selection perspective. And that says that it's really the individual differences between people that account for why they're different in terms of their economic status. In a way, you could talk about the social causation perspective, since everything is political today. The social causation perspective is much more consistent with a democratic point of view. And the social selection perspective, is much more consistent with a Republican point of view. You pull yourselves up by your bootstraps. You've either got the stuff to make it or you don't. And if you don't, it's just too bad. That would be an extreme view of the social selection perspective. At any rate, we're interested in how socioeconomic status is related to the way families function and the way that children grow and develop. And we've got these two different perspectives. One says it's all within the individual. The other says it's primarily within the social environment. So the social causation perspective, there's been a good bit of research about that, and my colleagues and I have done a good bit of that research, actually. And we've developed something called the family stress model. The family stress model says that economic hardship, when you're poor, when you are under a good deal of economic stress, it disrupts your ability to get by on a day-to-day basis. You can't pay your bills and so on. And that disrupts your emotional functioning. You're more likely to be anxious and depressed. And that influences the way parents treat each other and the way they treat their children. This parental dysfunction, then, their inability to parent as they normally would, creates problems for children. These ideas are reflected in a health disparities approach to child development, in which low SES is considered to be a causal risk factor for developmental problems. So the model, you can see, looks something like this. There are several different markers of economic hardship. Low income or poverty is an obvious marker of economic hardship. High debts and low assets. And this is oftentimes what happens to middle-class families when there is a downturn in the economy. They have a reasonably good income, but they've also acquired a relatively high level of debt that they feel is sustainable given that their income is reasonably good. But the bottom drops out of the market, unemployment goes up, people in the family lose their jobs or a job, and all of a sudden they can no longer cover those debts with the assets that they have. This is what happened when we started out in Iowa studying farm families. This is exactly what happened to farm families. They had high debt because that's what you were supposed to do. Every year when a farmer plants a crop, he plants his crop by borrowing from the bank to get the money for the seeds and the inputs and so on. And the land was always the asset that was used to cover those debts. That was what was securing the debt. Well, in the late 1970s, the price of land dropped precipitously in the rural Midwest, and there were no longer the assets to cover the debt. So those farmers were left with high debts, few assets, and anybody who looked at their books could tell them months before they realized that they were out of business. They just didn't know it. And the same thing can happen to a family doing reasonably well when all of a sudden the economy goes down. Negative financial events like losing your job and so on are other sources of economic hardship. Now, what we think happens when there's a lot of economic hardship, and one of the reasons I'm laying this all out, by the way, is because I think when it comes time to think about preventing problems for families or intervening with families in ways that can support them and help them survive more successfully, we can address any of these points in the process in a program designed to help families. So you might deal with economic hardship, economic pressure. We think that the psychological part of economic hardship that's important, whether you make $5 a year or you make $50,000 a year isn't important, other than the way it influences your ability to buy the things that you need to exist, to meet your material needs. If for $5 a year you could meet your material needs, you'd be fine. Your unpaid debts, having to make painful cutbacks, like cutting off utilities when it's 110 degrees outside and you no longer have air conditioning. We saw this in Iowa, by the way. We saw families in January with 10 degree below weather who would cut off their heat. but they couldn't afford to pay the utilities. So painful cutbacks create the kinds of economic pressures. Economic hardship, like low income, high debt, leads to these economic pressures, these daily pressures of not being able to buy the things you need and so on. And what that does in turn, it leads to a great deal of parent distress. Emotional problems, behavioral problems, some people drink more, and so on. Some people become extremely depressed. And when those things happen, you get these disrupted family relations. There's greater conflict between parents, or parents withdraw from each other, or they do both. And in turn, parents become more irritable. They're under a lot of pressure from their economic situations. They have less emotional energy to invest in their children. They're more inconsistent. They can become more harsh because of their irritability. And we see that playing out in our work. And so finally, when these disruptions in family relationships, like disruptions between parental relationships and disruptions in effective parenting practices, when those occur, then children are more likely to suffer emotional and behavioral problems. They're less likely to do well in school. Their competence is impaired by these kinds of circumstances. Now, if anybody has any questions, by the way, don't wait to the end to ask them. Just shoot your hand up and say, I don't have any idea what you just said, or wait a minute, does that have any importance at all for the kind of work that I do? I don't understand why. So I think that if you're thinking about intervention or prevention, you could intervene at any of these points in the process. Economic hardship. How do you keep people from falling into that situation? Economic pressure. Can you help meet people's material needs even though at the moment they are have economic problems? Parent distress. Interventions around emotional functioning and so on. Disrupted family relations. Help with family relationships, either between parents or between parents and children. And even help with children. We found in Iowa during when we first started the study that I'm going to talk about a little bit later, back in the 1980s, we found that in some school districts, school personnel were very sensitive to the fact that some of these kids were from homes that had lost the farm, had lost their income, were facing a lot of difficulties in life. And the kids got understanding and they got support in terms of dealing with that. For example, in one family that we interviewed, the kids were talking about the dad who was totally immobilized by the fact that he didn't know whether or not tomorrow he was going to lose his farm. And they would get home from school and they would say, well, we don't know if he's going to yell at us today or not, because he's just so angry all the time that we have no idea what he's going to do. Well, some schools dealt with those kinds of problems that kids were facing in a very sensitive and supportive way. And it was extremely helpful in getting kids through those hard times. Other schools, teachers in some other schools said, well, what's going on with your parents isn't your concern. You just need to do what you're doing. You just need to be responsible for what you're responsible for. So any point in this process is a potential point of intervention in terms of supporting families getting through difficult times. There's a second model that's related to the social causation perspective, the idea that socioeconomic status makes a difference in the way families function and makes a difference in the way that children get raised. And the family investment model says that when you're economically advantaged, it leads to a range of investments in children. Investments can include things like better housing, better medical care, or any medical care at all, good nutrition, better education, and more parental involvement in educational pursuits and so on. The idea of the investment model is that these investments lead to increased human capital and child competence, and the more competent child is more successful. So if you're a child living in a nice neighborhood, in a nice home, you're getting good medical care, you're getting good nutrition, you're getting help with your educational pursuits, your parents are involved in your educational pursuits, you do better in school. And if you do better in school, the likelihood is you're going to do better once you grow up, and you're more likely to go to college, you're more likely to get work that pays reasonably well and can support you in what you want to do. So this is the basic model. Parental SES, income and education, lead to these greater parental investments, and lead to more successful children, better child developmental outcomes. So if there's an economic downturn like the one that we've been through, then parents are less likely to be able to engage in these parental investments. They might have to move to lower quality housing. They might not have the money to help with special educational tutoring if a child needs it, and so on. So the social causation perspective has been supported in a good bit of research. We did a review article. I just put the citation here, Conger, and Martin. And we found that both the family stress model and the family investment model have gained support in the literature. So there's good reason from the research to believe that, in fact, these kinds of processes do take place. We see it out in the community, and I suspect many of you see it in your daily work with families and children. When we go out and conduct the studies and look at how advantaged or disadvantaged parents interact with their children, how the children are doing, and so on, we see evidence of the kinds of processes that are proposed by these two models. So the social selection perspective is a very, very different kind of animal. It says, it reverses the question, and it says that the abilities of parents determine both their SES and the health of their children. If parent characteristics are taken into account prior to adulthood, then SES should be unrelated to child development. And there is some evidence consistent with the selection argument, although there haven't been satisfactory tests yet, because we usually don't know what the characteristics of parents are before they become parents. In other words, the social selection perspective says that the kind of person you are back when you're a kid or an adolescent determines how you do as an adult, both with your children and in your work and your education and so on. But we haven't had studies that have really looked at those early characteristics to see how people actually do when they become adults. And we now have some of that research, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. There's an interesting, Susan Mayer is a sociologist at the University of Chicago, and she has this interesting quote. She says that parental income is not as important to children's outcomes as many social scientists have thought. This is because the parental characteristics that employers value and are willing to pay for, such as skills, diligence, honesty, good health, and reliability, also improve children's life chances, independent of their effect on parents' income. Children of parents with these attributes do well even when their parents do not have much income. So a really important question becomes, where do those attributes come from? And in some of the research that I'm going to talk about today, we're going to find out that to a significant degree those kinds of attributes come from being raised in an economically advantaged family. But understanding that still gives you the opportunity to find different points of intervention where you might help kids and parents in this process. So the social selection perspective, again, it says that pre-adult characteristics, the characteristics of future parents before they become parents, that those things lead to their later SES, their later educational attainment, and their later economic success. They lead to the later kinds of investments that they make as parents, but they also lead to later child developmental outcomes. Let me see if I've got this right. Okay, I want to be sure that I'm clear about this. Okay, so you have somebody who's an adolescent, for example, and before they become a parent, and they have certain kinds of characteristics, the kind of characteristics perhaps that Mayer talked about. They work hard, they're diligent, they persevere in the face of difficulty. They set goals, they know where they're going. People like that, the argument goes, the selection theory goes, they're going to be good parents later on, because those are the kind of characteristics that good parents have. They plan, they work hard, they invest. They're going to do well in terms of education and income because they plan, they work hard, they set goals, and so on. And finally, they're going to pass on those characteristics to their children, and that's going to make their children more successful. Now, they could pass on those characteristics genetically. It could be that if you're the kind of person who plans, works hard, conscientious, you know where you're going, those kinds of characteristics result to a certain degree from your genetic makeup, and you pass on that set of genes to your kids, and they have the same sorts of characteristics. Or it could be that just modeling, just because you engage in life that way, and your child sees you do that your child develops those same kinds of characteristics. So, very different perspective than the social causation perspective. So a colleague of mine and I, Brent Donlan, we sat back and we thought about all this, and we said, well, these are too simple. Either approach is actually too simple. It's got to be the case that there's an intertwining of what goes on that produces the kinds of outcomes that we're interested in for parents and kids. So we attempted to develop a model that incorporates both the social causation idea and the social selection ideas. And in the child development literature, our ideas are consistent with what are called transactional or systems approaches to child development. And we were especially interested in these kinds of characteristics that Mayer described that I just talked about. They're characteristics that are very consistent with what a fellow named John Digman has called alpha personality. There's a set of personality characteristics that you can actually measure in people that get at things like being pro-social, being socially competent, being persistent and planful, being emotionally stable and setting goals and so on. And Mayer called that alpha personality. And so we developed this model that's even more convoluted than the other ones we've looked at. But let me walk through it. Can you folks over there see if I point at this, or you're okay? All right. Okay, so if we think about 3 generations of family members, our first generation is going to be G1. These are going to be the parents, the original parents. And this is in our study, that's the way this works out, and I'll show you that in a bit. So G1 is the original parent generation in this set of families. And these G1 parents have certain kinds of educational levels and certain kinds of income levels. Some are very well educated, some are not very well educated. Some of them have quite a bit of income, some of them don't have very much income at all. And we think that income and education, that those things are going to be related to what we've called emotional parenting investments. There's a good bit of evidence that parents who have more income, consistent with the investment model, parents who have more income are better educated, they are more involved in the lives of their kids. And we think about this as emotional investments. Now, what's interesting in this theory is that the second generation, G2, if we start studying G2 when G2 is still a child or an adolescent, then we can actually look to see how G1 SES and G1 emotional investments, how they influence G2 alpha personality, the kind of characteristics that Susan Mayer was talking about, diligent, hardworking, planful, and so on. But the next important thing from the social selection perspective is to see whether or not these personality characteristics really lead to G2 SES when G2 becomes an adult. So now we've got this G2 adolescent learning from his or her parents. Will those characteristics that kid develops, will they influence how well he or she does in terms of later income and education as an adult? Will those personality characteristics also influence the way they parent later on? And will those characteristics lead to these kinds of developmental outcomes during adulthood, in addition to the influence of the characteristics of their parents? So let me give you an example. A good sociologist would say, well, the way people do in terms of education and income when they grow up is largely a function of how their parents were doing. So if they come from a well-to-do family, they'll be well-to-do. If they come from a family where the parents are well-educated, it's very likely that they will become well-educated themselves. So this nonsense about alpha personality is just nonsense. It really is the social structure in which they're embedded that makes the difference. It's not their personality characteristics, born rich, die rich. It's just kind of like that. You know, you inherit all this, you inherit these advantages in terms of the social structure in which you're located, and different kinds of personality characteristics don't make much difference. So that would be a strong social causation perspective. And you could also say that's this modeling that goes on of being an emotionally supportive parent that will influence the way G2 parents their children. It has nothing to do with these personality characteristics. It's just, you got good parents, you're going to be a good parent too because you're going to do what your parents did. So now we have a way to really test out these ideas. Will alpha personality make a difference above and beyond the earlier situations that these kids experienced in their families of origin? We can also see, we talked about the family stress model. The family stress model says that income and education, if people are disadvantaged, if they have low income, they're more likely to experience a lot of family stress. Remember, they're more likely to experience emotional or behavioral problems. They're more likely to have problems in their marital relationships. They're more likely to have disruptions in the way they treat their children. And we can see, we predict that family stress will reduce material investments in parenting. Family stress is expected to reduce emotional investments in children and so on. Here's where it all comes together. It could be the case that personality characteristics do make a difference in terms of how people do. Earlier personality characteristics do make a difference in terms of how people do later on, economically, in terms of the amount of stress they experience in their families, in terms of the way they operate as a parent. But it could be that it influences these social things, and it's these social things that then influence the development of the next generation of children, the G3s. These are now the grandchildren of the G1s. So if that's true, then we have support for both the selection argument and the causation argument, because these social factors are still having an influence on development above and beyond the individual difference factor, the personality factor. The selection argument by itself would be true only if there's a direct path from alpha personality to the G3 child, and none of these other things make a difference. Remember, according to selection, the selection argument, these personality characteristics that occur before you become a parent, they influence how you parent, they influence how the kind of success you have in education and income, and they directly influence the child, the development of the child. There's no direct path from these social variables to later child development. So all of these paths that are in this model, this interactionist model, would have to go away, and there would only be a direct path from personality to G3 development in order for the social selection perspective to be completely supported. Okay, I hope nobody's asleep yet. Well, let's see where it goes. So this is the argument that Brent Donlin and I are making. The argument that we're making is social and economic circumstances influence development of the G3 child and the G2 child, but those characteristics, and that's consistent with the social causation argument, the traditional argument, the argument that I made for 20 or 30 years. But these personality characteristics, though, also have an influence on the development of the social conditions that influence the next generation. So it's a reciprocal process. Socioeconomic circumstances influence the development of personal characteristics, which influence the development of later social circumstances, which influence the next generation of children. So it's a bidirectional, it's a reciprocal, mutual influence kind of approach. And what it does is it gives you, by understanding the greater complexity of what's going on, it again gives you a handle perhaps on better ways to support families especially families who are dealing with disadvantaged circumstances. Okay, so this is just some stuff. We've now done 4 papers using something called the Family Transitions Project, which is what I'm going to talk about next, which have supported some aspects of this interactionist approach. And you've got that in your handout. If anybody is having trouble sleeping, you could pick up one of these articles, and you'd have no problems. It's better than Ambien. I'm going to talk a little bit about the results of this study that Schofield et al. Did. So the Family Transitions Project is a study that we did in Iowa. We now have 3 large-scale studies that we've done with families and children. We started with this study of rural white parents in Iowa, and they were rural because it was the rural economy in Iowa at the time that had collapsed. I don't know how many of you remember the farm crisis, but it was a terrible time out in rural areas in the Midwest. They're white because at that time, those are the people who lived in rural Iowa. Interestingly enough now, there's a much larger minority population, primarily Latino, in a lot of areas in the Midwest. So we started in 1989, which was kind of the tail end of the farm crisis years. And the point of the study was to try to figure out what happened to families that had gone through these tough economic times. Started out with 559 adolescents. They're the G2s that I've been talking about. And their parents, they're the G1s, the first generation. Then in 1995, 1994 was the last year of high school for the G2 generation. We started off studying them when they were in the 7th grade. And it was sort of a malicious approach. We figured 7th graders are really hard for parents to deal with. They're just moving into adolescence. So you take these poor people, they're getting hit economically, and then they're getting hit with this kid who's striving for independence and doesn't understand what's going on with his or her biology. And so that was a double whammy, and we thought it would create especially stressful circumstances, and we wanted to see who was able to handle those situations and who was not. In 1995, that was the first year post-high school for this cohort of G2 adolescents. So we started following them and their romantic partners and their oldest child. So the G2s were followed from an average of 12 years of age, and they are now, I think this year they're 35, and we are still studying them. So we studied these kids when they were adolescents in their families of origin, and now we're studying them as parents and romantic partners in their own families, oftentimes of procreation. Over 20 years now, we have about 90% retention. People stay in the study, and they stay in the study because at this point, not because it's such a big whoop to have people come in and snoop around for several hours each year, but because they've become committed. In fact, some of the kids in the study now are professional psychologists and sociologists and so on themselves, and they're reading the results of the study. And so they have come to understand, many of them, the important contributions. These kinds of studies are extremely rare and extremely hard to do. I'm actually 35 years old, but you can see the toll that it takes. So anyway, the people have become very committed to the study, thank goodness. And we also pay them quite a bit of money, and that's important too. But I think for most of them now, they're really interested in seeing how this all plays out. So far, we have had what we do for the G2 adolescent when they become a parent for the first time. We recruit their oldest biological child into the study. And so far, we've recruited 350 of these G3 children. Some of them were born when the G2s were adolescents. Some of them are born much later, when they're on into their 30s. So the G3 children actually range from 2 to 17 years of age at this point. So in the Schofield study that was in that list of publications, at that point in time, I think this was up to about 2005, We had 290 cohort members. The G2, those would be considered the adolescent cohort in the study. There were 290 cohort members with a G3 child. 56% of the G2 adolescents were girls. So they've been followed to adulthood. In about 80% of these G2 families of procreation, 80% were two-parent families. So in some cases, this G3 child was being raised by a single parent. In by far the majority of cases, there were two parents in the home. Sometimes they were married, sometimes they were not. Sometimes the other parent was the biological parent or a step-parent. Average income of the G1s back when we started the study was almost $40,000 a year. The G2s now, the average income is about $50,000 a year, which is probably just a matter of keeping up with the rate of inflation. Average education of the G1s was 13 years, 14 years for the G2s, and I think that probably, as much as anything, an indication of educational inflation. People tend to get more years of school these days. Now, the big difference between the G1s and the G2s is we started the study when the G2s were adolescents, so their parents averaged 39 years of age when the study began. Now we're studying the parenthood of the G2s when they're still relatively young adults. So they're only 26 years of age in the study that I'm talking about now. So let me just go on. All right, I'm not going to go through all this stuff. I'm going to take you to, let's see. I will, for the G3 child, we had a measure of secure attachment, how securely attached the kids feel toward their parents. We observe them. One of the things that we've done in our research is we actually videotape parents and children and parent interacting with one another in the home. And we then code those behavioral interactions in terms of warmth, support, anger, hostility. So we get a different source of information other than just what they say about themselves. If you know, we're very poor describers of our own behavior. If you know that, if you've ever seen yourself on a videotape. And so we feel that this other information is extremely important. We get a teacher report for the kids, the G3 kids who are old enough, on their school competence. And then we have we use the Peabody Picture Vocabulary Test as a measure of cognitive competence for the kids. Results. All right, you don't need to see that. That's just confusing. That's confusing as well. But let's go back to that model. This one's real easy. Okay. So what do all those numbers mean? Let's see. I'm going to start over here. These numbers, let me do a simple one. Alpha personality to family stress. You see there's two numbers there. There's a 0.24 and a 0.07. The numbers in parentheses you can just ignore. You don't care about those. And they help us determine whether or not that relationship is likely to be significant, statistically significant. It's strong enough that it was unlikely to have occurred by chance. But the other number, the minus 0.24 there, that's the coefficient that we're interested in. That's called a regression coefficient, and it can range anywhere from -1 to +1. So if it's a 1 or a -1, it says that those two variables, in this case alpha personality and family stress, are perfectly associated with each other. If it's 1, they're perfectly associated. That is, if you know what their level of personality is, you know what their level of family stress is, because they're equated 1 to 1. Now, if it's a -1, it says they're exactly the inverse. If they have the highest, best level of personality characteristics, then they're going to have the least amount of family stress. That's what a minus would be. Now, what you'll see is none of the numbers are anywhere close to 1. This one, for example, from alpha personality to family stress is minus 0.24. So that means that there's a moderate relationship. That means there's a tendency for kids who were higher on alpha personality when they were in adolescence, there's a tendency for them to experience less family stress when they're adults. Now, the family stress in here includes things like the psychological distress of the parents, the degree of hostility in interparental relationships, the amount of conflict between parents, family stress, the degree to which the family really suffers daily because they can't meet their material needs and so on. Those kinds of family stress variables are what's in that measure. So what that says is that if a kid demonstrates those alpha personality characteristics, they're conscientious, they're planful, they work hard, all those things that Susan Mayer was talking about in her quotes, they're less likely to live in a stressful family environment when they grow up. And it makes sense. If you're conscientious, you work hard, you care about things, you invest in things, you plan for the future, you probably do that in all the areas of your life. And if you do that with your spouse, as well as do that with your money or your education and so on, you're probably going to have a better marital relationship. If you handle your money better because you plan and so on, you're probably going to do better in terms of meeting your bills and so on, even if your income has gone down for one reason or another. So it makes sense. But you'll notice that these personality characteristics were also influenced by G1 emotional parenting investments. See that coefficient of 0.33, a moderate positive coefficient. It says that those G2 adolescents who were raised by parents who invested in them emotionally, cared about them, were affectionate with them, set goals for them, appropriately disciplined them, had expectations for them in terms of behavior and so on, expected them to do the things that kids are supposed to do, and provided appropriate positive or negative consequences. Parents who made those kinds of investments had kids who were more likely to have these alpha personality characteristics, these very positive personality characteristics. So that pathway is consistent with a social causation perspective, right? Social experiences influence the kind of person you are, the kind of person you become. The kind of person you are influences later social situations. That's consistent with the selection argument. It's an individual differences argument. Individual differences in personality make a difference in the kind of life that you develop for yourself. Now, we don't see a direct relationship between SES and alpha personality. That all, it looks like it's SES down to parenting and investments and then to alpha personality. That's pretty consistent with either the family investment model or the family stress model. Economic conditions influence the way parents parent, and that influences child developmental outcomes. Remembering now that this alpha personality was measured when these kids were still adolescents. They're not adults yet. This was measured, in fact, this was measured back when they were in about the 8th or 9th grade. This is 8th or 9th grade here. And so emotional investments by parents increased these good personality characteristics. Now, consistent with the selection argument, these personality characteristics are positively related to SES. This SES now for G2, that refers to after they're about 25 years of age. Now they're adults. So we've gone from 9th grade here out to about 25 years of age. And this says, how many years of education did they get? How's their income looking? The upper coefficient refers to education. The lower coefficient refers to income. So alpha personality predicts at 0.46 how many years of education these kids are likely to attain. So that's a fairly robust coefficient. Remember, a perfect coefficient would be 1.0, and we usually find coefficients, these regression coefficients are, they're typically 0.3 to a really good one would be 0.5, 0.6. So 0.46 is really pretty robust. And alpha personality also predicts how much money they're going to make at 25 with a coefficient of 0.17. Now, they're still pretty early in terms of their earnings. Remember, at 25, that means that the kid who's going to be a surgeon in the future, They're still struggling through med school at this point. So they're not going to mess up like I did. There we go. So this coefficient could become much larger when we take this out to age 30 or age 35. When the people who are going to do best really hit their potential in terms of how much money they're going to make in their adult years. So alpha personality has an effect. And one of the things about these kinds of modeling procedures, this says that alpha personality has an effect on how they do in terms of income and education later on, net of or in addition to any kind of influence that their parents may have had directly because of their parents' education and income. See, this regression coefficient of 0.36 right here, it says that there's a 0.36 relationship between parent education and G2 education as an adult. So the social structure in terms of education does have an influence on how well this kid does in terms of their education later on. That's a very sociological kind of argument. The social structure, the situation you grow up in, influences the person you become later on in that domain. And this 0.17, that relates to income. 0.17 from G1 income to the adult income of G2. That probably also will get bigger as the G2s get older. If we ran these analyses today, that would probably be stronger than it is here. So what we're finding is exactly what Donlin and I thought we would find. We're getting selection effects out to later G2 SES, but we're also getting social causation effects. The social circumstances of the parents made a big difference in terms of the development of the social circumstances of their kids as an adult. But personality had an influence as well. They're both affecting the outcome.
This is really interesting to me because I'm from rural Iowa myself.
Oh, are you really? Whereabouts?
But don't you think that I'm from northeast Iowa?
Okay.
There's a town called Fort Atkinson, near Decorah. But in any event, don't you think that a lot of the stuff is really different in an urban setting versus a small town or rural area? Because comparing working here in social services and dealing with low incomes and all sorts of different socioeconomic issues and seeing the effect that it has on the family, to me is like vastly different than what it is in Iowa in a rural community. First of all, because the village really does participate in the raising and the rearing of the children, and I think it has a lot to do with where the kids end up as well. I think mental health, alcoholism, drug abuse, all those different things, there is a different animal than it is here. And there's more community influence there as opposed to here. And I think there's just more family involvement in the Midwest and the rural areas. You know, if the farm is failing, sometimes neighbors and friends and family will come in and kind of help out and get out there and, pitch in, where I don't see that in the urban areas as much. So I'm curious what your opinion is with what I'm saying here.
No, I think you're absolutely right. I think there are differences. There are different effects of community and different effects of place. There can be, but the underlying process in a lot of ways is remarkably similar. We've done this. We've looked at some of these. Now we've looked at the family stress model. We don't have the data from any of our other studies to take it out to 3 generations. But for the 3-generation studies that we've done, where we've looked at families with kids typically starting around 5th grade and going on into adolescence, the basic family stress processes that we talked about with these families from Iowa, those same processes seem to hold in African American families, in both rural and urban settings, and in Mexican American families. We have a big study right now of Mexican American families in California. The processes seem to be exactly the same. There are additional kinds of pressures typically that occur, especially in urban environments. So for example, our Mexican American kids, they're more likely to grow up in a neighborhood where there are gangs. They're more likely to grow up in a neighborhood where there are other serious kinds of disadvantages that add to the sorts of stresses and the sorts of struggles that the families are faced with. So certainly the economic problems can be compounded. On the other hand, there are oftentimes there's a lot of assistance between folks in those areas where relatives are there as well, or sometimes if they're immigrants, people who've come from the same part of Mexico, and they band together and they help. But generally, they don't have the level of resources that make it very easy for them, either as a group or as an individual family, to do well. But interestingly, the kids in the main are doing remarkably well, even from some very difficult circumstances. At least the kids in Sacramento that we're studying. In Iowa, this sense of community, it's interesting. In Iowa, in the late 1980s, when did you leave Iowa?
Well, I graduated from high school in '79, so
Okay.
I'm old. But I didn't leave Iowa per se. I've kind of gone back and forth, but I kind of left for good in the late 80s.
In the late 80s. But by the mid 80s, and I don't know whether you saw this in your area or not, but we saw several instances where the dad's a farmer and is leaving the farm and has lost the farm. And oftentimes what we saw there was a complete withdrawal from the community. This family now is embarrassed. They failed. Even though the economic situation was such that a lot of those farms were going to get lost. There's an estimate, I think in the 80s there were about 1.2 million farms in the United States, and the agricultural economists have estimated that all of the farm production could be done by about 12,000 farms. So you've basically got, if you think of farming just as a business, there's a huge excess capacity. And it was getting winnowed out for lots of different reasons at that particular point in time. But these guys were losing their farms oftentimes because they were doing exactly what they were told they should do: buy land. You should buy land because land is always going to be worth a lot and it's going to go up in value. And money is, the inflation rate is so high, it's next to worthless, so buy land. And they were buying land. And then Paul Volcker cut the interest rate, or raised the interest rates to reduce the inflationary spiral, which was exactly what had to happen in general in the economy, but it knocked out the value of land. And as I said earlier, these folks could no longer borrow and they were losing their farms. But what happened is, so this farmer loses his farm, he can't pay his bills, he can't pay his old friend that he's known since elementary school for his farm equipment. He owes him money. He can't pay the grocer in town. The banker, who he's known since they were kids in elementary school, can't loan him the money to go on. And there were bankers shooting themselves as well as farmers shooting themselves in the 80s in Iowa. And it was a very tense, difficult situation that really tested some of the bounds of these community, the kind of close community that we just heard about, which is pretty typical of Iowa. So anyway, the point of all of this is, and then I think what I should do is stop and, oh, go ahead.
No, finish what you're saying, then I would like to ask.
Okay. The point of all this is that this is a complex process. Where people start influences the kind of people they become. The kind of people they become, along with direct effects of their earlier experiences, influences the kind of parents they become, influences the kind of family stress processes they experience, and influence how well they do in terms of their own education and their own economic success. But these social characteristics then, the family stress they experience, the way they parent, those things influence, in this case, the security of attachment of their own children. Now, if we had the ability, we could go on and take these G3 kids and take them on out to their adult years. And I suspect that those who are more, we know from other literature, that those who are more securely attached, feel they can depend on their parents and so on, they do better socially, and they're going to do better in school, and they're going to do better in terms of educational attainment, and likely to a significant degree because of that, they're going to do better in terms of their economic attainment. Notice that there's only one direct effect for alpha personality to secure attachment. Alpha personality is having an effect on secure attachment primarily through these social conditions that personality helps to influence. At the next outcomes that we looked at, how pro-social is this G3 kid when we observe him interacting with parents, with the G2 parents. There is no direct effect of alpha personality. It's all through these social characteristics that influence the G3 child. Social circumstances influence the development of individual characteristics. Those influence the development of later parenting, family circumstances, and it's those social conditions then that lead to the outcomes for the next generation of children. So it really is an interactional process. Social circumstances, individual characteristics, social circumstances, outcomes for the next generation of kids. And again, these pro-social kids are probably going to go on to do better in their lives, and this process will go on and on and on. We could then go from G3 out to G4 and so on, and I think that's the kind of process. You can see it even in terms of receptive vocabulary, even in terms of cognitive, cognition, the capacity to learn, the ability to learn what you know and so on, oftentimes is thought of as very much a genetically influenced characteristic. But there's no direct effect from alpha personality out to receptive vocabulary, which is our measure of cognitive well-being. That's influenced primarily by parenting practices. So, general conclusions. There's general support for this interactionist model. Social circumstances influence the development of individual characteristics, and those individual characteristics go on to influence later social circumstances. We do need to add a genetic component to this work, and we're in the process of doing that right now. We need to replicate these kinds of findings in other samples. I don't know how that'll be done because I don't know anybody else who has data like these, so whether we'll ever have the opportunity to do that, I just don't know. We do need to consider G2 SES at later ages. We'll do that with this sample as we continue to follow them, because remember, at 25 they've not hit their peak earning years, so we really haven't seen as much differentiation in earnings as we will on down the line. And implications for the work that you folks do, I think that you can think of interventions or preventive efforts at any place in those processes. Intervening in social circumstances, income support programs, so on. Intervening directly when families can no longer pay their bills. Are there ways to help people deal with those kinds of daily stressors? Intervening in terms of the emotional well-being of parents. Intervening directly in the lives of kids. I think all of those issues are important. I also think it's interesting, it's also important, and this is something that's just become part of my beliefs in recent years. We always used to talk about character development. We need to develop the character of these kids. And by golly, I think there was a lot of truth in that. These alpha-linked traits basically lead to character traits in terms of planning for the future, working hard, setting goals. And it looks like those kinds of alpha-linked traits, as they're called in this literature, they do in fact seem to help prepare kids to do better economically, to do better in terms of their education, to do better in terms of raising their own children. And actually, it looks like it helps to do better in terms of their spousal and romantic relationships. So to the extent that we can help kids to develop those kinds of characteristics, and that's your expertise, not so much my own, the better off it looks like they're going to be. So with that, we could have a discussion.